Marcel. So you are down there in Joburg. So at the moment, how do you see the situation on the market with your existing customers and potentially your new clients who you are talking to? What is the sentiment in the market at the moment?
Thanks, Nunurai. I think it's a very good place to start. Of course, we all know that aviation is in a bit of a tough situation at the moment, worldwide, and Africa exactly the same. I mean, there are not many businesses around the world that can deal well with their income drying up overnight, essentially, and not having any cash income for several months in a row. So airlines as well as airports are hit very hard. What that means is, of course, that airports, let's talk about airports in particular, is that they've really had to watch their spending very carefully. They've had to cut all expenditures to make sure that they have enough cash to pay their normal outgoings, their salaries and other necessary things. So that obviously has a big impact on infrastructure spending. We had an earlier session where the COO of AXA, Airports Company South Africa, Fundi Sitebe, explained that obviously they are necessarily cutting a lot of their capital expenditure over the coming years because they simply don't have the cash income. And as the whole industry is hit, it's very difficult for them to get the industry regulators, the economic regulator to approve their capital expenditures. Traffic has been cut to a fraction of what it was before the crisis, and everybody can have their own forecast, but I think everybody agrees that it's going to take quite a while, a number of years, for traffic to really return to pre-crisis levels, and therefore for demand for new infrastructure to return to those levels. So in terms of capital expenditure in the industry, at this point, I think we're really seeing a very steep drop and big cuts across the board in infrastructure spending, which obviously reduces the need for infrastructure financing, which is what we're here to talk about, of course. So not a great outlook at the moment, I have to say.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot for outlining the situation at the moment. What about you, Moritz? Are you experiencing exactly the same, or there is something different into your?
Thanks, Nunurai. No, I can only agree with Marcel. We have invested in portfolio, including Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as the airports in Congo Republic, and of course, it's quite a hit if your revenues are cut to zero for a couple of months. So luckily, operations are starting again. Obviously, it will take time to recover, but at least we see some positive developments. As Marcel said, a lot of the capital expenditure is postponed. Airports always looking to adjust capacity to traffic volume, and with the current situation, we don't expect recovery to be that quick. So some time to maybe look at the business and improve other areas. I think the pandemic will change the way we look at airports and how we operate airports. So focus is probably more on sanitary measures, digitization, making sure there's social distancing built into the processes and workflows. So I think that will be the focus as opposed to expansion.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Alexander, what about you? Do you have at least some positive news for us? Do you have some projects still ongoing despite the crisis we are all facing?
Well, first of all, hello to everybody. Indeed, it's an amazing situation. In my more than 20 years career on the African continent and airports, I never experienced a situation like this. We were facing Ebola during a certain period of time, the eruption of the volcanic and also somehow the financial crisis, the civil wars in some countries, but such a drop we never experienced this. Nevertheless, I would say there is hope because the traffic is, according to few expectations, still be expected to double in the coming 20 to 25 years, because this growth might be delayed but not stopped. And we realize also we still continue having projects and business in Africa. There are countries which have locked down quite early, at the early stage, the borders, and they still continue domestic flights. And that means that also airports in these countries continue to operate to a lower extent, for sure, but still they operate. And these airports are then also ready, once the borders are open again and international flights take place, to be quite soon on speed and be ready for the international traffic.
Yes, thanks a lot, Alexander. Marcel, question for you. I mean, on the webinar we did together with NACO and AIIM, you have mentioned that potentially this might be a very good time for many infrastructure projects at the airport. The traffic is stopped or is very limited at the moment. So do you see any appetite for those kind of projects that potentially now can use this window to execute those projects which require, for example, closure of the runway or of a terminal?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been several airports around the world that have pulled forward some of their infrastructure projects, essentially to make use of the downtime that we currently have. For example, one thing that springs to mind is Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam that pulled forward the rehabilitation of their drop-off road and their landside drop-off road, which of course normally is busy every day, all day, but now was completely empty. So it was the right time for them to do that work. And similarly, we've seen some airports do that with runway and taxiway rehabilitation work. So there are some airports that are making use of the downtime. However, it all depends on whether the airport can actually finance the works, of course. It's great to have the downtime and the window to do it with less disruption. But if you don't have the funds to pay for it, then obviously it becomes very difficult to do it. On top of that, it's also good to keep in mind that infrastructure projects take a long time to be completed, but also a long time to get started. From the moment you have an idea or you have a need or a business case for a project, to actually get contractors on site to start works can take quite a long time. So it's not like the moment the crisis hit, we could start with construction works on Monday. There's quite a long period of planning and procurement that goes ahead, that comes before the actual work can be done. So not all airports have been able to do it. But some have, of course, and we would encourage airports to do it because it is a unique opportunity to make use of the downtime. But yeah, like I said, you need to be able to afford it, of course.
100%. So let's now go to the main topic discussions of the future. So Moritz, from your perspective, how the most basic question, so how the future of airport financing will look like in Africa from what you have as within your company as a strategy for the next couple of years, what you are hearing from the market, from your potential customers, from the environment, what we can expect in the next 2 to 3 years. So when we really need to recover the industry, what do you expect will happen in terms of airport financing on the continent?
Well, first of all, I want to second with what Alexander said. I think this is now a short-term challenge, but our long-term perspective on airports or aviation doesn't change. It's a very attractive space to be in. We've seen a number of shock events in the past. They're part of the industry. This is probably one of the most severe and longest shock events, but in the medium to long term, the sector will recover, and we're very confident and positive for the sector. As far as financing is concerned, I don't think our position has changed. We've been suggesting that PPPs are a good way to finance airports on the continent for some time, and I think now that message is stronger than ever. Public finances are needed in other areas. A lot of, or probably most or all of the countries around the world need to invest in social support programs or economic recovery programs. So that money needs to come from somewhere, and it's not available for airport financing. So I think from that angle, it's a very good opportunity for governments and airport companies to look at private sector involvement. And at the same time, the downtime that was mentioned earlier is quite useful in structuring projects. PPPs take a bit of time to structure, so having some room in terms of traffic and capacity probably is helpful in that process.
Yes, thanks a lot, Moritz, for that. Alexander, what is your view? How can we help to recover the aviation in Africa through airport financing in the upcoming maybe 1 or 2 years in the short term, and then potentially how do you see the future in the long term?
Well, first of all, in the African market, we were facing very often the situation, or in general, that the bottleneck is the financing. So the most critical part now is to find the financing, and also what is the most urgent need for the financing. Is it infrastructure, or is it the working to cover the working capital? So airports are capital-intensive assets which provide valuable support to a whole range of other industries, particularly tourism and logistics. Both OPEX and CAPEX play a key role in the economic viability of an airport. The main objective of the airport activities are the same as ever: safety and security, efficiency, economic vitality, responsibility. Out of these, the number one priority of every airport operator remains safety and security, reflected in the fact that airports on average spend 50% of their OPEX to ensure the safe and secure use of their facilities. Safety at the airports is essential, especially considering that a significant part of aviation accidents and incidents happen near or at the airport, during landing, taxiing, or takeoff. The implementation of new airport technologies is required in the air and on the ground to enhance safety in aircraft movement and operations. Despite the challenge of poor funding, as mentioned, holding back African airports in terms of meeting the technology needs of the airports, it is vital that African airports learn of such efficient technologies, as there is no substitute to safety. The future needs to be considered at present, specifically related to infrastructure. Airports need to prepare today for their market situation in 5, 10, or even 20 years, since it may take that long to actually develop or adapt the airport changing need and to provide the infrastructure and capacity that will be needed. For sure, it will be a challenge to find the right financing priority decision. It's important that airports remain flexible, innovative, and proactive.
Maybe I can just comment on what you're saying there, Alexander. I agree that what we see often is that financing is the bottleneck for airport infrastructure development in Africa, but it's not necessarily a lack of finance. It's not that there's not enough money out there. There are various options for financing from private sector to public sector. But it's often accessing that finance, and what you're saying is exactly right. It's about prioritizing what projects and then motivating for those projects and building them into a business case and eventually a financially feasible or bankable project that you can then take to financiers. So it's not necessarily the fact that not enough financing is available, it's difficulty in accessing that finance, I think. That's probably the biggest challenge.
I agree with you. Definitely, there is even a lot of financing in the market, but the investors who are looking for assets to finance in it, they will of course look also in the business plan and in the feasibility of doing this investment. They will also look if the country has the right instruments, legal instruments to privatize these assets and also to secure the investment. There are indeed different means also to secure the investment, like the MIGA department of the World Bank, which can secure somehow the the private sector investment. And there's certainly a tendency also to private-public partnerships in Africa, not to the extent yet as it is, for instance, in India, but for sure the future will go into more privatization of assets, and then also to lead to a private sector company structure, financial structure, and revenue structure.
You of course come from the private financing side. Would you agree with the statement that there is enough finance available but not enough bankable projects? Is that the way you look at the market as well?
Yes, indeed. I think there's always financing available for good projects. So it's finding those projects or structuring those projects, and that's where we'd encourage the dialogue conversation with the relevant airport authorities, government authorities, to see what can be done, because there are many options. It comes down to structuring the projects. What can the airport afford? What can the in terms of traffic, what can you afford with a view to revenues generated? What is the appropriate size of investment? There's a lot of things that can be tweaked to make a case bankable and feasible, and that's really a process that requires all parties to talk with each other, so that the financiers understand the technical and commercial operational requirements, the airport authorities understand what needs to be done to secure the financing, and that really works well when we engage with potential partners.
Welcome, Nunurai. I see you've managed to join. Yeah.
Yes, I'm finally in. My apologies for that technical glitch. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for having me. Moritz, well said. Thank you so much. So, Marcel, I wouldn't know where we are exactly, but I presume you just started with the first questions to Moritz.
Yes, pretty much. We really just started talking about the future of financing projects in Africa, and we landed on the fact that there seems to be enough funding available from different sources, but that it's about how airports can access this financing, how they can package the project. So that's really where we left off when you joined.
Yeah. Okay. Great stuff. So thank you so much for holding forth. Technical absence. So what I'll do now, I'll just take off from where you left off, then take on the next question directed to Alexander.
Fine. What about yourself?
How are you, Alex?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Good to see you too. I'm now great. So, Alex, the question that I have for you is, where will the most urgent airport financing be? Is it in working capital, or it will be in infrastructure development in the future?
In fact, I just mentioned also that airports will rely on capital as well to cover the OPEX and the CAPEX. It's difficult to say if it will be more on the OPEX side or more on the CAPEX side. For sure, for the moment, it's important to cover all the CAPEX-related sides in order to keep the airport in operation. But nevertheless, the airport needs to look into the future. And despite the current pandemic situation, the traffic is expected to grow and to continue to grow, probably not with the speed as we had now. The traffic for sure will not be stopped, but it will grow again. And therefore, it's important also to look onto the medium and on the long-term side, since it takes quite some years in order to adapt the infrastructure to the expected growth on traffic.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So one thing that we can agree is demand, it will be there gradual, it will be there in the near future. And the financing, it will be required, and it's also there. So, Marcel, based on your experience, let's talk about models now. So, can PPPs play a significant role in financing African airports? And are they successful?
First question, yes. Second question, also yes. I think there's definitely a big role to play for PPPs, as Moritz already explained. Government budgets are under pressure, both because of lower income levels and because there's a huge need for government intervention in health and education and in general economic support. That may not leave a lot of government budget available for airport infrastructure. So that's where the private sector really can play a role. We know that worldwide, Africa is one of the regions with the lowest private sector involvement in airports. I think only about 11% of all air traffic on the continent flows through an airport with some form of private sector involvement. The only region in the world with a lower percentage is the United States, and that's really because all of the airports there are by policy state-owned or government-owned. All the other regions in the world have got more private participation in airport development, so there's definitely room for that to grow in Africa. There's been a few successful examples, not that many. We have to realize that the African airport space is quite a small industry. There's only about between 30 and 40 airports with over 1 million passengers, which is generally considered to be some sort of threshold for financial viability of an airport. Some examples of successful PPPs, I think, are the ones that Moritz and his firm have invested in, the Segap airports in the Congo, Abidjan. Another successful example is Libreville in Gabon. On the other side of the continent, there's Mauritius and Madagascar that have very successful private sector involvement. And two small airports in South Africa, for example, in Syria and Kruger and Mpumalanga International Airport are both fully private airports, and they're doing very well. So there's definitely success stories there. That doesn't mean that private sector involvement in airport development and PPPs in particular are easy to pull off. They're in fact quite difficult, and they can take a very long time to materialize. There's also a lot of political discussion around whether a PPP is acceptable for a key national asset such as an airport. So I don't think all governments are really convinced that PPPs are a viable route. But looking at the international evidence and the African evidence, I think PPPs are definitely a viable option to be considered.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. Moritz, I'll come back to you. What role should financing institutions like the African Development Bank play in financing African airports?
Development finance institutions are critical as regards airport financing on the continent. The airport projects, obviously long-term projects, so to make them economically feasible, you need debt financing that matches the long investment period or the long life of those projects. And commercial banks on the continent are rarely able to give you the tenors needed to support these financings. So DFIs really play a critical role. There was also, in the context of COVID, a lot of work done to provide COVID-related funding, emergency funding, especially on the DFI side. We've seen a lot of movement. Unfortunately, it lost a little bit of the momentum, and I think many of the facilities promised to be very fast and flexible. It turns out to be a bit more difficult to access, but altogether, DFIs play a fundamental role in the sector to make these projects feasible. Nunurai, I've seen there are some questions in the comments box. If you allow me to answer one or two.
Yes, that are coming up. Yes, yeah.
Just I saw there was a comment on sovereignty, and I think it's important to respond to that quickly. There are a lot of questions around government's role in airports, and often people are concerned that private sector involvement is in conflict with the sovereign tasks of around airports as a public good. But I think that's where PPPs are actually a great solution, because you can split that sovereign authority in relation to, for example, regulatory roles. In the concession agreement, you can outline what the abilities of the private party are, and then you have the benefit of accessing private financing, but also the technical skill and operating know-how of the private partner. So in our view, PPP are a perfect mix of private support and
Okay, thank you so much. There's another question here from Paul Grumet, which I will direct to Alex. Heathrow runway cancelled, Birmingham upgrade cancelled, Manchester cancelled. Is this the way aviation will go because of forecast movements and parks are now out of the window? Alex?
Yeah, I saw the comment of Paul, and I greet him by the same way. I think the situation worldwide will improve as long as the trust comes back for travelers to travel. And the closing of full runways, Heathrow, Birmingham, and so on, might be, as Moritz and Marcel said, also for a short period of time. We were experiencing this situation with the volcanic eruption a few years ago, with some financial crisis to some extent also led to a downtown of traffic. But I believe it's a short-term issue. The major part is that trust for travelers come back, and for sure there will be an important task, not only for airports and airlines, but also the industry, the authorities, and the whole social community to be involved. So tasks which used to be in the past very much separated are becoming very much integrated in order to bring back the traffic to normal and to open the runways again.
Okay, thank you. Marcel, how would you relate Paul's question to the African context? You mentioned that about 30 or 40% of African airports have 1 million passengers throughput per annum. How would you relate that to the current situation and moving forward?
It's about 30 to 40 airports, not percentage of airports, 30 to 40 airports with about 1 million passengers, which are the big capital airports and the major hubs on the continent, of course. I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, quite a few airports have cancelled or have postponed infrastructure developments in Africa as well, mainly because of the lack of funding that they have at the moment, the lack of finance, the lack of income. But also because, as Paul is pointing out, that the traffic forecasts have all been invalidated because of this crisis, and airports will have to relook at what their traffic forecast is. When do they think they're going to reach the 2019 levels again, and what is the growth going forward looking like? So, in my view, these cancellations or postponements of projects is a temporary thing, as Alexander is also saying. We do still expect the aviation on the continent to grow in the future. It's just that we're going through a crisis now, which is obviously setting back that growth by a number of years, depending on how you look at it. But once the growth picks up again, the need for those infrastructure projects will come back, and companies will be able to then restart them and hopefully access financing at that point to get them done. That ties into one of the things that Moritz was saying, that it's actually a good time now during this downtime to prepare for these projects and to structure them in a way that they will be interesting to financiers when the time comes for you to approach a financier. Pulling off a PPP project, for example, can take years. So if that's what you want as an airport, if that's what you have in mind for your future development, then it makes a lot of sense to start that now, even though the demand might not be there immediately at this point. By the time you have your structure set up, by the time you have your plans in place, you have your designs done, and you have your financiers on board, we might well be at a stage where the traffic is back at the 2019 level or even exceeding that. So I think it's a temporary delay in projects, and that going forward, the project will come on stream again, and I would advise airports to make use of this downtime to prepare for these projects.
Okay, thank you so much for that. If I could come back to you, what risks can financial institutions face in financing airports in Africa? What is the major underlying risk?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a wide range of risks involved in any investment project or any construction project. The major one in investing in airports is I think the revenue risk, or the traffic risk, if you like, and that is the risk that the traffic does not turn out as high as you had forecasted it, because obviously you invest expecting a certain return, expecting a certain traffic to materialize, and that giving you a return on your investment. And if the traffic then lags behind what you had expected, you're not making the money that you had expected. So there's a serious risk of that happening, and this pandemic is a perfect example of that. People that had invested in airports, or even in airlines for that matter, were expecting traffic to grow and their revenues to pay back their investment. Now, this pandemic is obviously preventing that from happening, because the traffic is ground to a halt essentially. So traffic and with that revenue risk, I think, is the major one. Another one that's probably very important, particularly on the African continent, is the political risk. If you're doing a PPP, you're obviously entering into some sort of business arrangement with the government. The government being exactly that, a government, they always have the ability to change the operating environment. They can change laws or introduce new laws. Political support for PPP projects might be dependent on the ruling party at the time. And after an election, the sentiment might change, completely changing the operating environment for a public-private partnership. So I think particularly in African countries, the political risk is also a significant one that investors need to take into account. I don't know if Moritz would agree with me there, or maybe he has another view or additional risks.
Absolutely.
Yes, I was thinking the same, that Ppps.
No, I absolutely agree with Marcel. He mentioned quite a few. There's obviously a long list of other risks, but those are some of the most important ones. As far as political risk is concerned, as an African fund manager, we're quite comfortable with political risk across the continent. I mean, it's our job to assess and get comfortable with it. We've got our boots on the ground through offices in 4 countries across the continent. So the political landscape is one that we understand very well. Traffic risk was, of course, mentioned, especially in the current environment. That said, though, we take a long-term view. Our investment horizons are 7 to 10 years. So hopefully this is a short-term challenge, but we expect that in the long run, traffic will recover. And I think there's some promising numbers already. I read yesterday that China is at around 80% of the pre-COVID capacity already. And I guess China, where it all started, gives us perspective on where the rest of the world could follow. The recovery is shorter than expected, but even if it takes a year or two, it doesn't fundamentally shift the attractiveness of airports over.
Hello, Alex?
Yes.
Yes. I wouldn't know if you have anything else to add on that one.
I want maybe just to add about the political risk. I mentioned earlier that political risk to some extent can be mitigated through the department of the World Bank called MIGA, which can guarantee somehow the expropriation risk, the risk of change in law and so on. But I would also say the African market has a huge potential for privatization, but more than half of the countries don't have a privatization law yet. And that's the first step which should be done in a country is to get the privatization law in. But to get a privatization law in, there is a need also of a political will. And as long as the political will for this is not present, there will be no privatization. And then for sure, an investor will be reluctant to get into this country. Still, there might be some risk with a privatization law, expropriation, change in law, and so on. But these type of risk can be mitigated. So it's maybe a call for all investors looking to invest into airport assets in Africa, that they should not be afraid about political risk, but they should also seek to find some guarantees through respective financing organization, like as mentioned, the World Bank.
Okay, thank you so much. There is a follow-up comment from Paul. That's okay, but with focus in doubt, financial viability is in question. So that's the follow-up. So to come back to you, Alex, how will the funding of African airports likely going to be different from that of advanced and developed markets, for an example, in Europe?
Yes. Well, Europe is a mature market. Although major improvements have been achieved, still the African airport infrastructure compared to European airports is aged. The size appropriated, technology not updated, and safety and security deficient. Many airports in Africa were built in the 60s and 70s and are in a dire need of extreme makeover, leading to a considerable funding challenge. Majority of African airports rely on funding from development banks, as mentioned, such as the World Bank, European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, or even African regional development banks, either in form of a loan or a direct investment. The European airports, they don't have this need of development banks as it is in Africa. So the private sector is increasingly, as mentioned, investing in Africa airport assets, leading to a tendency of private-public partnership. And as mentioned, not as in the extent as it is now in India, but the way is promising to go into that direction. And investors who are carefully evaluating the request for financing based on a business plan and feasibility study, and afterwards will watch carefully the business results of the airport activity. Also, African airports are less and less ministry or authority department driven, but becoming self-running state-owned corporates with structures and processes as in the private sector, as we used to have in many airports or the majority of airports in Europe, for instance. So airport corporatization or privatization is not new in Africa. And its success is measured in service level and cost effectiveness. It is critical to ensure that infrastructure development matches airline growth projection and operational requirements. Unnecessary infrastructure development results in additional costs and inefficiencies and can weaken the case for funding requests wherever it is at investors or international financing institutions. So the target compared to Europe is the immediate challenge is to modernize and improve the African airports, to make them better, not bigger.
Nunurai, may I just add one or two things to enrichment? Because Paul mentions financial viability, and that's obviously relative. So if we don't have a lot of traffic, we don't need a lot of investment in, or we don't need investment in expansion. Of course, safety, security is key, so some investment is required in that respect. But the beauty about airports is that you can adjust the infrastructure to the demand. So as traffic increases, new projects will be viable, and then you can invest in an expansion project. Just to pick up one more point that Alexander mentioned was a comparison with Europe, and I think there the African continent probably has in that in Europe you can replace traffic through rail and road, whereas on the continent the rail and road infrastructure is in fairly poor shape compared to Europe. We have much longer distances to cover, so in my view, in the medium to long term, for inter and intracontinental traffic, aviation is critical. So I think the recovery here will hopefully be a bit quicker than elsewhere.
I would like to add to Moritz, indeed, infrastructure is key for the economic growth in Africa. It takes years to build roads and railways. And if you compare, if you build 3 kilometers of road, the car will drive 3 kilometers. If you build 3 kilometers of railway line, the train will move 3 kilometers. But if you build 3 kilometers of runway, then the airplane will go everywhere and in a short period of time. And that's why I believe that airport infrastructure is key for the continent Africa and for the development, and there is also for the social and economic development of the continent.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, with that close statement. So, gentlemen, we have 5 minutes to go until our session runs up. Can we have any parting words, Marcel?
Yeah, sure. I think we've covered quite a bit during the discussion, but the one takeaway that I would like particularly airports to walk away with from this session is that this downtime that we're having and the reduction in traffic that we're having may postpone certain investments and postpone the need for certain capacity increases. This is an ideal time to really prepare and do your plans, do your master planning, do your new traffic forecast, plan your projects, prioritize your projects, do your design work such that when the crisis comes to an end or when traffic returns to a more pre-crisis level, that you are ready with your projects that are feasible, that are bankable, that are well structured, and that you've made contact with financiers already, such that you can really get going the moment the traffic returns and the need for that infrastructure returns, that you are ready. So I'd really urge particularly airports, but everybody in the industry to really use this downtime to prepare so that we can come back out of the crisis stronger than before.
All right, Marcel, thank you so much for your parting words. Moritz, any parting words? Okay, I think Moritz. Okay, we'll move on to Alex. Any parting words?
Yeah, this panel is about financing, and financing is in many sectors key for everything, and specifically for the airport sector. So the airport of the future will also be the one which depends on cooperation, maybe with other airports, but certainly with airlines, authorities, industry, investors, and financing institutions. So roles that are today often much separated will become even more very integrated. These are times of challenge and change for the aviation sector, no doubt about it. But the aviation sector has the talent, the capacity for innovation, and the determination to meet.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was the session on future of airport financing in Africa.